Hello again, YouTube, and today I want to talk about a concept which I talked about on Twitter a little while ago and got a bit controversial, and always seems to get a little bit controversial, but it's this idea of passing privilege, or as we might call it, cis-passing privilege. I've got a lot of complex thoughts on this, and I know a lot of other people do, and it's important to kind of, when we're talking about this, to really appreciate the nuance of it and that it's complex and situational, and there's not a lot of hard and fast rules, but I have a lot of kind of thoughts and beliefs about it. I think it's a really interesting subject to talk about, but first I guess we should define what I'm talking about when I'm talking about cis-passing privilege. So a lot of people just abbreviate it to passing privilege. It's a concept that is used not just in the concept of transgender people and cisgender people, but it's used in lots of spheres. But I'm specifically talking obviously about cis-passing. Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this idea that a transgender person could be believed to be, or treated as, whatever that means, a cisgender person in everyday society. So, for example, what we might call a cis-passing trans person might, when walking down the street, people might not realise they're a trans person. And obviously that carries with it a lot of other things that could happen. Similarly, it's things like, if I, a trans woman, am making a phone call, people at best are going to think I'm a trans woman, but more than likely they're just going to think I'm a man just because of the sound of my voice. When we're talking about cis-passing, we basically just mean, in that scenario, or perhaps more generally, is that trans person being read as trans, or are they being read as cis? Now, let's think a little bit more about what that actually means, because in order to be cis-passing, we have to have an idea of what a cis person looks like and what a trans person looks like. Now, obviously, in our kind of queer and trans circles, we tend to kind of have a little bit more of a progressive view on that, and we say, well, what does a trans person look like? But we have to remember that in society, we're talking about society in general here, and in society in general, people have a very clear idea of what they think a trans person looks like and what a cis person looks like. Isn't necessarily accurate, but they have this idea. So, for example, if they see a woman and they can see a bit of stubble on there and she's 6'2", they're going to start thinking, is that a trans woman? They might not be a trans woman, but they're probably going to start thinking that. Similarly, if a trans woman is 5'5" and has had FFS, facial feminization surgery, and looks really typically cis looking, people may well think, oh, that's not a trans woman. And depending on the person, they may treat that person very differently. For example, you're going to get situations like if a trans woman is out with a couple of children and she's obviously trans in the sense that people perceive her as obviously trans, people are going to expect a different relationship between her and those children. That, for example, they may not believe that they're her children, they may believe they're someone else's children, because of course trans people couldn't possibly have children. And let's be frank, there's a lot of cases where they might believe that she's a threat to those children, because people treat trans people abysmally. And obviously we've got all the stuff in the press at the minute where they're trying to paint us all as paedophiles, so that's wonderful. If they perceive her as cis, then they're going to potentially assume that she's the children's mother. And then different conversations may arise that they wouldn't have if it was a person they know to be trans. Obviously, this idea of cis-passing as a privilege comes from the fact that by treating someone differently, someone who is transphobic is going to treat a cis person probably better than they're going to treat a trans person. It's quite simple. Now, people tend to get a little bit exercised when we talk about cis-passing privilege, because a lot of people, or trans people who do pass as cis, at least some of the time, because obviously it's situational, don't like this idea of calling it a privilege, because a lot of people say, well, actually, in order to access this cis-passing privilege, as we're calling it, I have to self-filter and I have to behave differently and I have to do things that are not necessarily me, but I have to do them in order to fit in as cis. Now, I fully appreciate that, and I think actually, this is why it's difficult to call it a privilege, and perhaps we need to find another word, but I don't know what that word is, so I've gone with privilege for now. The thing is, I call it a privilege because they're able to do that. So a cis-passing trans woman she may not necessarily want to have to, put on a full face of makeup every day or dress in a very femme way or whatever in order to be perceived as cis, but she can do it. So if she knows she's going into a situation where her trans status is going to be a problem, she can do things to mitigate that. A trans woman who isn't cis-passing probably can't do that, and therefore there's no chance of accessing that privilege. To take the example I gave earlier, if I'm going to phone up somebody and have to and speak to them on the phone about something, for example, if I'm phoning my bank, the bank have got my name down as Natalie. If I phone up and say I'm Natalie, I can pretty much guarantee you that straight away the person on the other end of the phone is thinking that I'm committing some sort of fraud, because they're listening to my voice and thinking, well, that's not a woman's voice. Straight away, things are difficult. If a trans woman who's got a very cis-passing voice phones up, she's probably not going to have that problem. That voice might take extra effort to do, but she can do it and therefore avoids a problem by doing so. I cannot do that because I cannot do that with my voice. So that's where being cis-passing is a privilege. And remember, we're not just talking about physical appearance here, voice is another thing as well. So let's talk about the potential benefits and risks of this. Of course, we've talked about this idea that being cis-passing is a privilege, and in everyday life it's quite easy to see how it is. A cis-passing woman can walk down the street, no one will shout tranny at her, because they don't realise she is. A non-cis-passing trans woman will walk down the street and probably get abused. That happens. We can take this to extremes. A cis-passing trans woman might be less likely to be beaten up or murdered. Of course, there is a flip side to this, that as a cis-passing trans person, there might be times that you need to disclose your trans status, for example, in dating or in healthcare or something like that, where it becomes relevant. That's a situation where it could become dangerous, because obviously for someone who is obviously trans from day one, they might get an initial bout of transphobia, but the person that they're dealing with knows from straight away, so they're not surprised, and that may not give them some sort of bizarre excuse to be violent. If the person has to disclose, perhaps 2 or 3 dates in, for example, to dating someone, and the person that they're dealing with finds out that they're trans, that's when we can get problems which could be even worse. So it's important to recognise that this cis-passing privilege we've talked about is situational, and it really depends. Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad, but I personally believe it's still mostly a privilege. So how does this fit in generally? So hopefully you'll probably be aware of this concept called intersectionality, which is this idea that there's lots of different privileges that intersect, and that, for example, if we're talking about being cis-passing as a privilege, then that is a privilege, but it doesn't mean you're automatically more privileged than someone else who doesn't have it. Privilege isn't this kind of universal value that you can add up all these privileges and subtract some other ones and work out what your privilege value is and compare it to someone else. That's not how it works. Being cis-passing is a small privilege that you might have over another trans person, but you're still trans, which ultimately is very much not a privilege. So, please don't go thinking that if I'm saying you've got cis-passing privilege, that your life is perfect, because it's probably not. That's not how things work. But it just means that there are situations in which you're able to access this privilege, which may make you safer in certain situations or more comfortable in certain situations, and you won't have to deal with things that perhaps someone else does. The other thing that we always say about privilege is that quite often the people who have it aren't aware of it, and I can't think of a situation where this is more true than here, where trans people typically think they look quote unquote worse than they do, but also people don't like to be told they've got a privilege, and a lot of the time people get quite defensive about being told they've got cis-passing privilege, because they don't want to seem like they've got this privilege. They feel like it invalidates their struggle in some way. That's really not what it's about. But we really should be quite conscious of the fact that having cis-passing privilege probably really doesn't always feel like a privilege, because of what I said about, if you've got to go to loads of extra effort, you're constantly worrying about being outed because it's quite tenuous. There's something could go wrong and you could be outed, and then suddenly that privilege is lost. So it can feel sometimes like a burden, but I guess it's a different burden to not having the possibility of accessing that privilege in the first place. I wanted to talk a little bit about how actually this can play out in society as well, because typically we see that people who have got some sort of cis-passing privilege are people that society might celebrate a little bit more. We know society celebrates beautiful people in a very stereotypical way. The people that are celebrated as good looking tend to be sort of white, blonde women, or muscly men or whatever. We all know the way that society celebrates that. This obviously plays out in terms of cis-normativity as well. So obviously, typically the people we celebrate as beautiful look cis, because that's what society says is good. As a result, the people that often get to represent trans people in society meet those standards. So for example, if you think of famous trans people, typically the people you're probably going to name, if they're not people who were famous or had some sort of platform before they came out, are probably people who are fairly cis-passing. Because, hey, guess what? You're probably going to have more Instagram followers, or you're probably going to get on TV more if you're cis-passing and therefore meet kind of beauty stereotypes. That's how the world works. Because of that, these are the people that tend to have more of a platform, and more people tend to listen to what they have to say. So therefore the problems they face are what gets talked about more in terms of the transgender community at large. This means that things that are important to them reach the top of the agenda. For example, we see a lot of what gets talked about with trans people is access to ID and their proper gender. Now, that's important, and clearly having the right gender on your documentation, your passport, birth certificate, or whatever is good. No one's going to say that's a bad thing. But to me, for example, whether my birth certificate says M or F probably doesn't actually make that much difference, because no one's going to look at my birth certificate and see an F and go, oh yeah, well, the probably person isn't trans then, because I look trans, I sound trans, it's obvious. So it doesn't make that much difference to me. But to someone who's cis-passing, that can make all the difference, because it means there's far fewer situations in which they're going to be outed. For example, if they have to go and get a new job and have to show their birth certificate, because that's typically what you have to do, you have to show some sort of ID to get a new job, it's not outing them. So straight away they can start that job and no one knows they're trans. So this is how it plays out, that problems that face cis-passing people typically tend to be the ones we talk about more. How often do you hear about trans people in the news talking about dating and whether people should disclose their trans identity when they're dating, and how many dates is acceptable and should people disclose before their relationship gets physical? Again, to most of us that doesn't matter, because people know anyway just from looking at us or listening to us. So again, it just shows that this privilege, it doesn't just play out in day to day, but it plays out on a kind of a more macro scale in terms of what issues get talked about. So finally, I just wanted to make a few acknowledgements. So we've talked about how it really is this privilege, if we can call it a privilege, and perhaps privilege isn't the right word because it is so tenuous, but this privilege really is situational, it really is conditional, and it's not that great a privilege sometimes, it's quite small, but it is still a privilege nonetheless. So it's important that we acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge that it really doesn't feel like a privilege sometimes to people, but privileges often don't. White people don't tend to feel their white privilege, they just notice when it's not there. Or they don't notice when it's not there because it's never not there, but people don't like to have these privileges called out. Finally, I guess it's good to be clear about who we're talking about when we're applying cis-passing privilege to people, because of course, it's easy to see how it plays out when we're talking about a trans woman who has transitioned and has had any surgical treatments or whatever that she wants to have, and can settle down into a life where nobody knows she's trans. It's easy to see it there. It doesn't necessarily apply if we're talking about a trans person who wants to undergo some sort of medical transition but hasn't started it yet. So if we're talking about a pre-transition trans woman who is still kind of presenting as a man and all that kind of stuff, you could argue they have a cis-passing privilege, but I don't really think it applies in this context because they're not out yet. You know, you could apply it there, but it's not really what we mean when we're talking about cis-passing privilege. Similarly, how does it apply to someone who is non-binary, for example, where what does kind of presenting as non-binary even mean? You know, it doesn't. We have to get past these old-fashioned ideas of what presenting as a certain gender means, because any gender can look any way they like, and that's valid. And it doesn't. This whole idea of looking cis and looking trans is actually very wrapped up in old-fashioned ideas of what a given gender looks like. And so, from that kind of gender politics perspective, the whole thing is nonsense. But of course, what we're talking about here has to acknowledge the fact that we're living in a society which does have gender stereotypes, as much as we don't want them, and does have ideas of what trans and cis looks like. So if we're talking about cis-passingness for a non-binary person, actually, if a non-binary person is cis-passing, then actually they're being misgendered, because cis-passingness only recognises male and female. It doesn't recognise non-binary identity. So, you know, in the same way that a trans woman who is being read as male and a trans man that's being read as female, cis-passing could mean being misgendered in that situation, which is why we don't talk about it in those contexts. It really is restricted to that narrow idea of a trans woman being read as a cisgender woman, a trans man being read as a cisgender man. Those are the situations in which cis-passing privilege can exist. That's the way I look at it. Anyway, I hope that was not too controversial. It probably was, but you know, if you liked that, please leave the video a like, leave us a comment, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. Come and find me on Twitter if you haven't already. That's generally where I'm hanging out if you want to shout at me for anything I said in that video. But yeah, please do those, and if you've got comments, please leave them below and I'll try and respond to them, and maybe, you know, do another video on this in future. You know, the important part with ideas like this is that we're always learning, we're always kind of evolving our viewpoint, and that's what all this is about. So thanks, and see you next time.